Welcome to today's webinar entitled 5 Shades of Grading, How Inconsistencies in Performance Reviews Cause Turnover. The webinar is being recorded and will be available for download on our website in the Learning Center, usually by the end of the day. We will send out an email with a direct link to download the slides and the recorded version. My name is Linda Janak. I'm your host, and I am also the CEO of TalentGuard. We are a full-service, cloud-based talent management software and consulting company. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with me today. I invite you to ask questions throughout this webinar using the GoToMeeting question feature. I will hold off on answering your questions until the end of the webinar if time permits. If time does not permit, I'll typically take all the questions that have been submitted, answer them, and send them out with the email. The conventional approach to performance management is a subject of great debate. In many organizations, performance management is a low priority. Various different studies indicate that 58% of managers said performance reviews are ineffective, 90% of appraisals don't work the way it's structured today, and 44% of HR leaders don't think performance reviews are accurate. What's even more troublesome is that 1 out of 5 employees believe that their bosses don't think about appraisals until they're actually in the room giving the actual feedback. My goal today is to share insight on why performance management isn't working and to help eliminate inconsistencies that may be causing havoc for you internally. If done properly, performance management can be a highly effective talent management strategy used to reduce turnover and increase engagement. Let's look at inconsistency number 1, the mission of performance management. Many definitions of performance management exists. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to bucket it into 2 different categories. The first category being compensation and promotion driven. This is typically the conventional approach to performance management and the most widespread in organizations. It includes the process of setting goals for the year, being evaluated on those goals at the end of the year with the use of a performance scale, ranking employees numerically, and awarding compensation, stock, and promotions. The second model is what I refer to as the growth and development model. This is a new approach to performance management with emphasis on structured feedback between managers and employees, and sometimes other stakeholders. This process does not use a performance rating scale. I'd like to explore the pros and cons of each of these as the foundation for this webinar today. Let's talk about some of the pros for the compensation and promotion-driven model. Well, one of the pros is that typically in this review process, we're very focused on results rather than behaviors and activities. I believe that a mistaken belief among managers is that the attainment of results trumps how someone actually achieves it. In my experience, how is important because it represents the development journey of the employee, so it should not be underrated. It aligns employee activities to the goals of the company. So performance management can do a good job of focusing on organizational goals, the programs needed to achieve those goals, helps us cascade them to the right teams and individuals, and ultimately tracks progress. When this measurement chain is monitored, it ensures alignment with overall results of the organization. Typically, it cultivates a system-wide long-term view of the organization. So we get to have that, it kind of brings everyone together under the same terminology and thought and process rather than being haphazard. And it can produce meaningful data. When you're able to capture the right quantitative and qualitative data, the information can be useful in benchmarking and creating best practices within your organization. It helps direct employee training, as well as management development and other HR programs. It also fosters, typically and relatively speaking, equitable and fair compensation to employees based on specific metrics. Some of the cons of this model is that employees see the performance management process as benefiting HR and the organization rather than truly being focused on an individual's personal career development. It can be political. Merit raises are sometimes subjective. There's a theory out there that managers sometimes rate those that they like best higher than those producing actual results. Compensation is almost always tied to the performance review process, so the higher or the better the score you get, the bigger raise. And there's questions about what's being measured. Oftentimes, I see organizations measure soft skills such as integrity over business objectives or job role related skills. Let's compare that to the growth and development model. Some of the positives of this model is that it is more employee-centric. Since employees are naturally focused on themselves and how they can grow their career, they're typically more intrinsically motivated to provide and ask for feedback more often. And when managers spend time speaking to employees about their personal aspirations, great results can happen because they feel more valued. It's an ongoing process. As I said, when employees have a self-interest in their career, development is more continuous rather than once a year. I like to use the analogy of someone joining Weight Watchers or Jenny Craig, for example. A person has a weight loss goal in mind that they want to achieve in a specific time frame. In this scenario, they don't wait until the end of that time frame to evaluate their progress. Instead, they focus in on losing weight in a dynamic and real-time way. They check in with their counselor often. They track their calories and activity in an app similar to MyFitnessPal and more. And they know instantly whether they are on track or not. We don't use that same mentality in organizations, and we should. And this is where I believe the industry is moving toward. When you have an ongoing process like that, fewer performance surprises exist, and you can tend to start to build stronger manager participation in the performance process. From a con perspective, it is more time-consuming. And it's more time-consuming for the manager because they have to spend more time writing up very unique content and having those regular structured conversations. And they have to have those conversations not once a year, but many, many times, either throughout the month or the quarter. Managers need extensive training if you're going to use a feedback-only model with no ratings. And as you are well aware, getting managers to provide feedback even with a rating model is very difficult. So we have to put some formal processes in place to ensure that they're ready to stand alone without the security blanket of those ratings. And it is a cultural shift for the organization, and I think this is something that you really need to think about should you move in this direction. Moving toward a growth and development model instead of traditional ratings is complex, especially if your company encourages pay for performance. In the absence of specific numerical values to serve as benchmarks, assessing employees becomes, quite frankly, a muddy task. Measuring outcomes is already challenging enough when ratings exists, so eliminating the dependency of performance ratings can be very scary. Inconsistency number 2, the psychology of rating scales. I personally believe that most companies or HR departments don't understand how to use rating scales effectively, and this can cause a lot of havoc internally. Performance reviews typically use 4 types of review measures. And I bucket these. On the top, you'll see descriptors and numbers. These are typically more compensation and promotion driven. And color scale, and when I say none, I mean no numerical scale, I'm really talking about feedback. Let's explore these measures in more detail and learn how they drive inconsistencies in the review process and ultimately impact turnover. In August 2014, 3 very impressive people, David Rock, Josh Davis, and Beth Jones, published an article entitled "Kill Your Performance Ratings. Neuroscience Shows Why Numbers-Based HR Management is Obsolete." In the article, they discuss some very fascinating concepts about how one's brain responds to performance rankings. And I'm going to share some of these insights with you. They indicate that labeling people with any form of numerical rating or ranking automatically generates an overwhelming fight or flight response that impairs good judgment. They have seen that the neural response is the same type of brain hijack that occurs when there is an imminent physical threat, like a confrontation with a wild animal, as in the picture that I have above. It primes people for rapid reaction and aggressive movement. So it just puts people on the defense. It is ill-suited for the kind of thoughtful, reflective conversation that allows people to learn. And that's what really a performance review is all about, to learn from the performance review. I believe it's an interesting theory, but I also believe that many issues with the numerical rating stems from a lack of understanding and management training on how to use it effectively. And I'm going to talk about the 5 reasons why. The inherent problems in grading stem from a misuse of category labels, biased assumptions in performance review questions, using an unbalanced rating scale, having the optimal number of points to be effective, and a lack of understanding about what truly should be measured throughout the performance management process. Let's look at category labels first. The words used as descriptors and rating scales require some thought, because words do have a psychological impact on people. Many scales don't set the right intervals between the words or the rating scale. Here's an example. The perceived psychological leap between awful and fair is not the same as between fair and slightly good. And I want you to really think about that for a minute. When you're thinking about, if I'm evaluating myself or a manager is evaluating someone, that's a huge leap, right and left, to think about when I'm going to rate an employee. When selecting your labels, you need to be sure that you test how people perceive the adjectives and the distance between the interval scale. And what complicates it even more is that when you have a multi-generational workforce, each of those groups may respond differently to your adjectives and or labels. Now, another area that we have to think about is when numbers are used standalone and or with descriptors, more caution is needed, because employees perceive numbers as the harshest of all measures, and it trumps your descriptors. In other words, they put more emphasis on the number rather than the adjective. So you might have a set of great adjectives, but if your numbers don't align with your adjectives, they'll tend to pick the number over the actual word. So framing the performance review questions should not include implicit assumptions. And what do we mean by that? In the examples above, the question, both questions, are automatically assuming that the employee either enjoyed working for the company and that they have concerns when none may exist. This is a simple mistake often made by HR teams. It's not intentional. It just happens because they don't have a lot of experience in forming how they want to structure and measure outputs from a performance review. We need to refrain from using any biased words when designing our internal performance reviews. Next is balanced versus unbalanced. And this is the first thing I look at when I am working with an organization. If you look at the rating scale in red, which is the most commonly used rating scale in business, it is unbalanced. We can see that we have 3 favorable options: excellent, very good, and good. And we're using 2 unfavorable options, fair and poor. If we have this type of scale, it will always skew how managers rate toward a more positive response or outcome. If you look at the rating scale in green, we would call this a balanced rating scale. Why? Because we have 2 favorable responses, a neutral response, and 2 unfavorable responses. This scale will typically drive a more evenly distributed distribution scale. I want you to think about your own performance review or reviews, because sometimes organizations use many different ones with many different scales, and think about whether it's balanced or unbalanced. Research has also proven that the optimal number of points is a balanced 5 or 7-point scale. In addition to that, there have been many studies released that indicate that bias exists toward the left side of the scale. Now, there's been debate on whether to put the most positive descriptors on the left or on the right. In my experience, when I'm working with organizations, I have typically focused on pay for performance and putting those positive adjectives on the right. Whereas if if an organization is more growth and development oriented, I put the positive adjectives on the left. More research needs to be done in this area to determine if changing that direction has a valid impact on scoring results, but it's just one of the best practices that we have provided so that we can, and we're still evaluating it, like I said, to see if there is any sort of impact. And we've seen it across the board, even beyond the things that I've mentioned here today. We've talked a lot about descriptors and number scales for that kind of compensation-driven model. Let's shift focus now and spend time reviewing a performance management model where no numerical rating scale is used to assess employees. More and more companies are exploring the no ratings model to reduce stress and improve employee engagement. Companies such as Zappos and Adobe have been using this method for years. However, as I've mentioned earlier, it is a major culture shift because we lose the security blanket of formal numerical ratings and input. With that said, employees want to and should take an active role in their career development and how well they're performing. The no rating approach requires a structured feedback model in place to foster career development and performance improvement. Managers must have extensive training on providing feedback for it to be effective. And when I've seen this model be effective, it has significantly improved engagement and reduced turnover. But it takes a lot of time to get there and a tremendous amount of investment, and we need to be patient as we shift toward this model. So without a formal rating scale, the definition and measurement of goals becomes paramount. And sometimes I use goals and objectives in the same breath, whereas objectives are more corporate oriented and goals are more individually oriented. Both are paramount. Employees and managers must be able to articulate and discuss where improvement is needed and wanted. They must also be able to gauge how much development is required to achieve goals and close gaps. Since employees are usually bad at self-assessment, more pressure is put on managers to help the employee gain awareness of the level of development required to demonstrate continuous improvement. I advise that companies use a standard development terminology during ongoing feedback discussions. I think a good example that TalentGuard uses consistently when we coach people is presented here in the development box. So when we're giving feedback as a manager to employees, we'll say no development is needed, slight development or slight improvement, some improvement, much improvement, or huge improvement. With that kind of development mindset, even though it could be considered a quote-unquote rating scale, it really focuses on development and it moves forward versus the performance scale, which labels you with the level of performer that you are. Another great option for the growth and development approach is the use of a color bar. The color bar can contain any number of colors and any colors of your choice. Here I'm just using kind of shades from red to green. Each color is typically used to indicate where in the development cycle an employee resides. For example, red could mean the employee does not yet possess a specific skill and huge development strides are needed. Green might mean the employee meets the skill level and little or no improvement is needed. We are seeing a shift just within TalentGuard's clients of them migrating to the use of a color bar like this. So let's explore some of the pros and cons of the growth and development model. One pro is that employees and managers have more meaningful and regular conversations. Again, we have to make sure those conversations happen and that our day-to-day activity doesn't put those as being a second level priority. It is far less stressful than traditional reviews. Employees typically get more aligned with their role and kind of focuses a little bit on lattice development, if you will. So if I'm in my role and I want to move across or up or even down, if we're having a decelerated career in an organization, we get some focus there. In terms of the cons, as I said, it takes more time. Managers must become skilled coaches. As you know, it's a bear to train managers to give feedback. A lot of managers don't want to give feedback. So we've got to put a lot of time and emphasis on preparing people. And it's a behavioral change. We're changing how people have done things and what they're used to. So it will be a frustrating change management process. One of the things I'm still trying to see as the industry works out the no rating scale is the lack of hard data to drive some of the predictive analytics, since that is one of the key buzzwords happening in the industry, because it's more qualitative in nature. So how do we pull out certain types of information to know if we are headed in the right direction and hitting those goals? And we also have to figure out, when we're capturing these conversation and feedback, what types of things do we need to keep for record keeping? How are we going to track that I as a manager and you as an employee are working toward improvement, especially if I'm on a PIP plan. So we really need to think about how that is going to work out and how much information is good so that we're complying to what needs to happen in the organization without going overboard. Inconsistency number 3, subjectivity in the performance process. And I sometimes think this is the most challenging. What does a rating really mean? If a group of managers observe the same employee performing a task for an extended period of time, each manager would rate the employee differently. Let's look at a real scenario where a rating system produces sometimes more consistent outcomes. And I'm going to refer to a television series you may all be familiar with, Dancing with the Stars. It differs from how most corporations evaluate, and that in Dancing with the Stars, most of the judges are former professional dancers or choreographers. Each of the judges has spent countless hours in training, learning every specific detail about poses, flow, dance sequence, emotion, etc. There is a high degree of formal training and consistency built into that judging/rating process, making it more objective. The challenge in business is that managers have different backgrounds, trades, degrees, experiences. They've taken different trainings and have been coached or mentored by different people. There is little formal training about how to evaluate someone, and there's no consistency built into the review program, resulting in that subjective process. Organizations can only overcome this process with effective training. And I think if we use some of these things like the Olympics or Dancing with the Stars, we can start to think about how to eliminate guesswork. I want you to noodle on that for a while. So what is the result of these inconsistencies? Well, if we don't have our mission of performance nailed, if we don't have a balanced rating scale or no rating scale, if we have subjectivity in the process, which is typically our conventional performance review system today, we have major corporate issues. It's no surprise. And those issues impact organizations year after year after year. This is why we still have huge turnover. This is why we still have employees not engaged in their work, and why CEOs are still worried about the talent gap. So how do we kick out the old and bring in a new philosophy around performance management? Well, performance management starts the day you interview a candidate by setting expectation for the role and educating them about performance management and your philosophy until they retire or leave your organization. During your onboarding process, employees must be exposed and entrenched in your performance management philosophy. They need to be trained on what good or great or excellent looks like in your organization. And I'm not talking about, a few hours. I'm talking about weeks of training. And I personally believe that the best performance management program uses a combination of development ratings, improvement ratings, it's numerical, and a formal, structured, ongoing discussion system. Having spent countless hours coaching employees, I was a former career coach with thousands and thousands of coaching experiences, and having worked with employees one-on-one, if you nail, the employees do want to know where they stand, and they also want to know that you're concerned about their personal development. If we can bring those two things together, we are going to have transformation in the workforce. So as a foundation, this is one example of a training tool that TalentGuard uses when educating what great looks like. And as you can see here, we use the improvement rating scale. We provide a deep and broad explanation about the rating scale descriptor, including overview about the type of improvement that must be observed by employees, managers, and others, objectives that must be attained, behaviors that need to be demonstrated, and the types of goals achieved at different levels. Now, this is a very simplistic view. This can get very extensive and very deep. But as I'm just trying to demonstrate here, the type and level of information needed to get people on the same page, and so that we can start to minimize guesswork. So we train managers on this extensively. We do countless case studies in an open forum where we have group discussions about interpretations. And we do this so that managers can learn to rate more objectively across the board within your organization. I believe this one training tool goes a long way in eliminating the gray, i.e. subjectivity and inconsistencies, during the performance management process, and it helps organizations achieve better transparency around measurement. In addition to training managers on what great looks like, we must also train them on how to give structured feedback. And HR consists in two areas. Teaching managers what I call a growth-minded framework that supports employee-centric goal setting, how to measure progress using a framework like we just showed you, discussing future aspirations without promising a promotion, for example, and the right way to recommend development in the best interest of the employee and the company. That has to be complemented with a structured approach for what managers and employees should discuss in their one-on-one feedback sessions. And we need to teach them how to discuss certain areas, and things I'm speaking about above are career growth, contribution, collaboration, innovation, in those meetings so that we have focus and they're not just haphazard discussions with the manager employee saying, how are you doing today? What are your goals? Thank you very much. And they leave. And the employees are still feeling dissatisfied. So we have to bring formal tools, a mindset, and a framework for feedback together to be effective if we're going to change how the conventional performance management process works today. The impact of effective coaching, and I know this firsthand because I've done lots of it, is that employees will absolutely feel that they have improved career development, productivity increases, you will have a more engaged and happy workforce, turnover will decrease, and ultimately that impacts your bottom line. In summary, focus on talent development, not just doing an annual performance review by checking the box. Employees are too smart and too sophisticated for that one-time process. Employee and managers should be engaged frequently, not once a year. So HR has to have an ongoing marketing campaign that educates, reminds, and encourages people to do this. When compensation is linked to reviews, it puts pressure on the employee and the manager. So we like to separate those activities. And as we say, separate compensation and merit increases from discussions of true performance and development. A few words about TalentGuard. As I said, we offer a full suite talent management solution. In that suite, we have performance, which we talked a little bit about today, 360-degree feedback, certification tracking, our two most popular, succession and career pathing, and follow-up development planning. And we are happy to answer any questions you have about how we approach performance in our product. Just a a couple notes on that. We support formal descriptors, formal numbers, and no feedback in colors. So, really flexible on how you want to roll out your performance management process internally. Our next webinar and white paper, just if you are interested, our May webinar is Job Hopping Internally, how this trend will keep your employees engaged in your organization. That's on May 13th. You can sign up online. We also have a white paper, How to Successfully Implement Performance Management. It talks much more in depth about what we've discussed here, and I would highly encourage you to check out one, sign up, and check out the white paper. We also have many more webinars online about all topics that TalentGuard focuses on, and I would encourage you to take a look at those as well. At this time, this is where I'll answer questions if we have time, and I'm going to just take a minute to bring up the question pane. Thank you.